Welcome and thank you all for joining us for this very important discussion. This forum is being sponsored by the Anti-Racism Committee of the Community Church of New York. My name is Rose Creighton. I am the committee chair. The other members of the group are Faye Bennett-Lord, Janet Koplos, Patty Paris, Ellen Rader, Marian Rancoli, and David Strawn. This is the third forum in the series, Empowering the Vote. Today we will be addressing the topic from a different perspective. Empowering the vote, capitalism, racism, and caste hit home. I am sure you would agree with us that a functioning democracy depends upon an informed populace. Our nation is on the brink of fascism due to its lack of knowledge, miseducation of its citizens, its unwillingness to embrace the totality of its past, and to make recompense. We also believe that our system is better characterized as a plutocracy, where an elite moneyed class rule and keep the rest of us ignorant and divided by the false concept of race, caste, and class. And the more we understand this, the better prepared we will be for a struggle for a true democracy. To join us in this discussion is Dr. Harriet Fraad. Dr. Harriet Fraad is a licensed mental health counselor and hypnotherapist in private practice in New York City. She writes and speaks on the intersection of politics, economics, and personal life in the USA. Her work can be found on her website, harrietfraad.com, as well as her podcast, Capitalism Hits Home. She presents a radio program, Interpersonal Update, on WBAI in New York City every Wednesday at 2:30 Eastern Standard Time. She appears on the David Feldman Show on Monday nights at 8 Eastern Standard Time. Harriet Fraad also appears as a regular guest on Economic Update's 100 radio stations. She's a regular guest on the Julia Volano Morning Show on ACT TV in New York, and on Women's Spaces on WBBK, Sonoma County, and North San Francisco. Dr. Fraad was a founding mother of the Women's Liberation Movement in New Haven, Connecticut, and has been an activist for her entire life. Dr. Fraad.
Thank you very much. Today I want to talk about race, class, caste, gender, and capitalism. First, we should know what we're talking about, because these are terms that are thrown around without really defining them. And often we have different ideas. You think about it, the word love is thrown around, but when you say, I love you, what does that mean? You know, people have very different ideas that can lead to a lot of confusion and hostility. So I'm going to define my terms. Caste is derived from the Hindu caste system in India. It's a hereditary social class that restricts the occupation of their members and their ability to associate with people of other castes. And it's a rigid social stratification that's built on hereditary membership in that caste. It's really a way of dividing people from one another, which is similar in many ways to race. Race is one of the main groups to which people are often considered to belong, based on arbitrary physical characteristics like skin color, hair, size of mouth, and so on. These are really arbitrary. They only become important when you want to enslave people or exploit them. The idea that people can be divided on the basis of physical characteristics is bizarre. It's an arbitrary way of dividing people, which was a handy way of exploiting people's labor and enslaving them, or exploiting them for your own profit, which is part of our history indeed, and I'll go into that later. Gender is a set of arbitrary meanings that are posited on the physical differences between men and women. Those are psychological and intellectual attributions which have no basis in biology, just as race has really no basis in biological differences. Human beings are basically the same, human brains are the same, but these are a set of meanings that allow one group to use another for their own benefit. There's a very good, well, there are books going into all of these, which you can get easily. I want to now define class and capitalism because they're inextricably related to each other. Class means all sorts of things. People use it as class is property, who has property, who doesn't, or they use it as power, class is power, who has the power and who doesn't. But I think that that doesn't really apply. Who has property? Okay, the richest person, the most money person, I think, in the world is Elon Musk. I don't think he has more power than President Biden, who isn't that rich, or even more power than many, many other people. He just has more money. And of course, he can buy some of our legislators with that money and therefore have some power. But wealth is not the same as power. It's different. Class is produced also not by wealth, because Elon Musk is the richest man in the world. He doesn't have the most power in the world. Those things are related, but they're not the same, and we need to know what we're talking about. By class, I mean questions. Who is producing the wealth? Whose work produces the wealth? Like if you work at Amazon, you're working to produce wealth for Jeff Bezos and his board of directors. So class can be divided there into the owner, Bezos. I'm sure he has other people cut in on this, but this is for simplification to understand, and the employees, all those people that work for Bezos. And so that it's who produces the wealth and who gets to take that wealth and do what he wants with it. There have been different class systems throughout history. There was slavery, in which the slaves created were property and created wealth for whoever was in charge. In Egypt, the slaves provided wealth for the king, who was the pharaoh. People say, only because we're in a class system, they say, Pharaoh built the pyramids. He didn't drag any stones. Of course not. It was those slave laborers who dragged stones to honor his power and his wealth and his class position as the head of that society. So class is defined by who does the work and who gets the money. Capitalist employers, I'll take two of the four biggest employers in the United States, let's say like the Walton family that owns Walmart and Jeff Bezos that owns Amazon. They are the employers. Those tens of thousands of people who, no, actually 1 million people work for Walmart and more like 1 million for Amazon as well. They work and their work is sold and the profits go to Jeff Bezos or the Walton family, who decide how to distribute it. Now, they do distribute some to their employees or they wouldn't have employees, but they decide what they're going to do with all that money that they've gotten. So, for example, Walmart has a special desk where they help their employees get on food stamps, which of course enables them to pay so little that people can't afford to get good food. But that's a decision. I have to have something on my screen. I've got it off. And Walmart also pays roving managers to listen in to see which employees are talking union so they can get rid of them. That's a payment they decide to make. That isn't a payment that the employees might prefer to make, of course. Just like Amazon, Jeff Bezos spent hundreds of thousands of dollars paying strike breakers, paying companies to come in and persuade people not to vote union. It failed on Staten Island, but they certainly had a huge and very expensive effort. They spent almost as much as they would have letting the strikers win. But that was their choice, because the employer who gets the money from everyone else's work gets to choose where it goes, to salaries, to strike breakers, whatever he and the board of directors choose. And these definitions really overlap with the definition of capitalism. Just like in the slave system, it's the slave owner and the slave. In the feudal class system, it was the feudal lord and the serf. In capitalism, it's the employers and the employees. That's who decides to collect the money, who can collect the money, and decide how to distribute it. One of the very early things that allowed terrible racial discrimination and capitalist exploitation was the message from the Pope of 1493. In 1493, he sent out a papal bull. It didn't mean bullshit, that bull, it meant message. The papal bulls of Pope Alexander IV on May 4th, 1493, said that any land not inhabited by Christians was able to be, quote, discovered, which means claimed and exploited by Christian rulers, and the Catholic faith and the Catholic religion should be, exalted and spread, and that the health of souls be cared for. And those barbarous nations who are not Christian can be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. And that was the basis of all the, quote, discoverers who discovered land that people discovered hundreds of years before, and who settled, and then allowed those conquerors, which we have read in school are discoverers, even though they discovered something already discovered, allowed them to come overtake those lands and exploit the people there. Those people were characterized as savages because they weren't Christian, which entitled their conquerors, like Columbus, recently celebrated, to kill them, rape them, take their land, and put them into slavery or servitude in order to enhance the feudal wealth of the king. Following that, where that little escapade where 55 million indigenous Native Americans were murdered and their land stolen, and they did try to use the Native Americans as slaves, but they wouldn't cooperate. They chose to kill themselves instead, and so it wasn't the profitable thing they needed. Plus, they had their own language and their own customs intact. So they decided to go further afield to Africa, where they enslaved African people. The slave trade followed. From the first founding of the United States, there was slavery based on race, which is arbitrary physical characteristics like skin color that were woven into a meaning system of inferiority that allowed the slave owners to use free labor and get rich and decide how to use the money that the slaves generated through tilling cotton. There's a very interesting thing in our history as Americans, which I sure didn't learn about in public PS 81 or PS 9 or anywhere else that I went to school, which is Bacon's Rebellion, which was a real institutionalization of racism in the 1770s in the United States. Most people who came to the United States initially were bondspeople. That meant that their fare was paid and then they owed approximately 7 years of labor without any rights or any pay. They had to be given food and lodging of some sort in exchange for their passage. The state of Georgia was mainly settled by prisoners who they released as bondspeople who then had to pay the state back, England back from where they were sent from. So that most settlers were not these elegant creators and owners of land. They were semi-slaves. They were enslaved for 7 years or so, and if they ran away, they were beaten and returned, and their enslavement, really, their bonding, was extended. And in Bacon's Rebellion, what happened was Bacon, who was a feudal lord and relative of the governor of Virginia, wanted more land and more possibilities, and he joined with Native Americans and with bondspeople who were automatically white, and with the Black people there, some of whom were slaves and some of whom were freed Black men who had slaves themselves. Because slavery and race were not so deeply intertwined at that time, and they rebelled against Berkeley, who was the governor of Virginia. And they rebelled together. And the crown got worried. If Black underlings and white underlings can get together, we better watch out, because there's a lot more of them than there are of us. And so they passed the first explicitly racial laws slating that Blacks were inferior and whites should have privileges over Blacks in order to disrupt the unity of people who really had the most in common, because they were giving their labor and the owners were making money off of it. And that's how they controlled a potentially rowdy and united labor force. So what they did was prevent race laws to provide solidarity between people who had a lot more class in common, because they were all employed to make money for someone else, than they did division. It's a good example of how this works, because gender, for example, is something that's used to assign meanings to women's physical characteristics that then are used to get women to do sexual labor and household labor and emotional labor and child rearing for men. Now, women are beginning to rebel against this, but that's how it's used to divide the population. And that's how race is used. And that's how caste is used. And that's how class is used, which is all up and down the line. You know, Black women earn 58% of what white men earn as of the 2020 census. White women earn 82% of what white men earn. They keep these divisions between us in hopes of pitting us against each other instead of our uniting. And here comes the hopeful part of what I'm talking about amidst all these awful things. Right now, there is an enormous movement. It has won in countries like Chile, which has a socialist government for the first time since Pinochet, a dictator that Americans helped put, not average one of us, but the government helped put in. Colombia has its first socialist government, Colombia, South America. And France has its first united socialist group. And who's uniting here? Who's uniting are Indigenous people, Native South Americans, Black people who've been extra discriminated against on the basis of race, feminists who've been discriminated against as women, as well as climate activists who want to save our planet and are discriminated against because they don't want the profitable fossil fuel industry to come into being. And they unite with people who want sexual possibilities of all different kinds. And in every one of these victories, that's happened. It's happened in France in the latest election, where now France Insoumise, France Unbowed, which is the coalition of all those groups that were divided and made inferior, have gotten together and won, which has meant a 15% increase. They won in parliament. Macron is still the leader, although highly unpopular. They passed a 15% increase in the minimum wage in France, as well as an added 10% for civil service workers. And they will pass many, many other things because they are the majority. It's interesting. Excuse me, I have to take a drink of water. It's interesting that in the US, they say that the party that won the most votes for parliament is the fascist party. But that's not true. They came in third. Macron came in first. Second came France Insoumise, the United Left Party. And third came the fascists. And this is an amazing thing that's happened. It's happened to change all the arbitrary divisions between people that are used to enhance capitalist exploitation and keep the mass of people from each other. They've also, in Cuba, there's been an amazing victory in which they have now the most progressive, supportive, excuse me, family code in the world. Hasn't been much publicized here, but it was a family code that was created with 80,000 neighborhood meetings that talked about what kind of family policies they want. And over 1.5 million people participated. They sent their suggestions to the government, which then sent them out to them again, to those 80,000 neighborhood groups, and they decided on what they would propose. And then France on September 25th, not France, Cuba on September 25th had a referendum, and the new family code was adopted. It was voted for. 67% voted yes, and only 33% voted no, in spite of the fact that both the Catholic Church and the evangelical churches contributed hugely to campaigns against that law. And what did that law do? It declared that men and women were complete equals, that domestic work had to be shared, that there are severe penalties for domestic abuse, that children are human beings and they should be in custody of their parents, but not controlled by their parents in ways that are brutal. They also outlawed all physical punishments against children or adults. And they made gay marriage, any marriage of love is a recognized marriage, so that all sorts of gay, whatever, LGBTQIA+ arrangements are honored. And they also gave full state benefits to anyone who stays home and cares for children. So that caring labor is celebrated. And they ended the Cuban law of the father, which had that the father was to reign, that was ended. That's amazing. That really is amazing. The same thing to cut down those arbitrary barriers was done in New Zealand by Jacinda Ardern of the Socialist Labour Party. she found the equivalency between all kinds of caring work, because in New Zealand, the people who do caring labor, like the home health aides in the US, are usually people of color, Maoris, or Pacific Islanders. And she made their labor, like heavy lifting of a patient, is equal to any trucker who has to do heavy lifting or anyone else who does. She made equivalencies across the board and raised the salaries of caregiving workers, from social workers to nurses, aides, and home health care workers got a 30.5% increase in their salary, for which she taxed, to get that money, she taxed the richest New Zealanders. And that was a way of stopping caste, class, and race divisions between people by keeping them in lower paid and dishonored jobs, something that certainly happens in the United States. We could follow New Zealand and Cuba's good example. At any rate, it's capitalism that benefits most from these arbitrary divisions between each other. And the most important thing where we could win, this is most of us, if you count people of color, of all sorts of colors, if you count women, over half the population, if you can't count people who want different sexual arrangements, that's 1 in 10. If you count people who care about the planet, that's an enormous number. If we all get together, we'll win too. We'll win in the United States. And that's the good news, I think, because I'm all for that. So if people have any questions, I'll certainly try to answer them. I've ended on a hopeful note, I hope.
Okay, we're going to take a few questions from the committee, and I'd ask that everyone keep their questions brief and comments brief. So I will start with Patty. I think you had a question.
Okay, I'll ask my question. What policies do you think we should be pushing to ameliorate the problems of the differences between race and caste capitalism?
One policy is to follow the wonderful example of New Zealand, where you don't have whole groups of work that are low pay. You look at, for example, a hospital. The person who cleans the floor in the hospital is just as crucial as the surgeon, because in a dirty hospital, people would get infected. So you'd have to look at people's contributions and value them accordingly. So the surgeon doesn't get hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and the guy or woman who cleans the floor can't make ends meet because they get barely minimum wage. You'd have to look at the value of work to the whole contribution, because without cleanliness and order, we'd all be lost. But because that was women's work and also Black women's work, it was utterly unvalued. You'd have to revalue that labor. That would be a big change in terms of who has money, in terms of class, because the employees would not be as humiliated and would be better thought of, and in terms of gender, because it's usually women who do these cleanup roles. And so that would be one thing you could do. You could also have a domestic code like Cuba does that values that work, so that people who stay home and do caring labor still get Social Security and the other benefits. They're not lost. That's one of the reasons why 10 million women had to drop out of the labor force to take care of their children, and they didn't keep their benefits, and they didn't keep their seniority. And that's outrageous. That's one of the reasons why women get lower wages, because they're doing care work. We'd also have to have maternity leaves. Like Germany has a 5-year maternity leave. All the Scandinavian countries have maternity and paternity leaves. And in some countries like Norway, paternity leave is mandatory, so fathers don't get extra credit from coming in when they should be home helping out. You could have free childcare and after school care, which would enable all children to get a universal quality education. You could do something about education in this society. You know, over 70% of children of color, who are usually confused with poor children in this country, they mix up race and the amount of money you have, didn't do schooling over the pandemic because they didn't have anybody at home to help with their computer, or because there was no one to supervise them, or because the family was too crowded and too chaotic, and so they just lost out and they're behind. That's an outrage. Private schools have had teachers tutor up to 3 kids at a time throughout the pandemic, so that when they came back, they were prepared. Private schools like the Ethical Culture School or Dalton or Walden, which cost $43,000 a year tuition, and those are in the lower grades, it goes up in the upper grades. They managed. We'd have to really address those things that we ostensibly believe in. And of course we could, just by cutting down the $1 trillion armament budget, even after we've lost the last 3 wars, you could have a lot of money for this and use it that way. It's all possible. We just have to demand it and know it's there.
Okay, thank you. Faye, I believe you had a question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fraad. Such an enlightening discussion. And even though you shared something about Bacon's Rebellion and climate activists, and I guess how we should even think about what's going on in India, or I guess we could even think about Tehran, the women there throwing off the scarf. What is the intersection of racism, capitalism, and caste that will allow us to push forward to save our democracy and not take us backwards?
That's a great question. Also, I should clarify that my spelling is F-R-A-A-D. I don't want to be mistaken for Harriet Fraad, which isn't so flattering. Oh. Not that you did that, at any rate. What we'd have to do, I think, well, state your question again so it's clear to everybody. It was a great question.
So what then is the intersection of racism, capitalism, and caste?
What the intersection is using other people to make money, and in order to justify using them, attributing inferiority to them. Inferiority of race, caste, or gender, and then attributing those physical characteristics to lesser intelligence or a mission to serve other people. The theory for subjugating women, and I have this in mind because in the early days of women's liberation, I debated some Yale anthropologists who said that women's role based on that of our some of our ape ancestors was to serve designated men and children. And I was on that panel with Naomi Weinstein, who was a brilliant brain surgeon. And she cut right through the pretense and she said, oh, for heaven's sakes, you have your monkeys, we have our monkeys. Let's get down to it. We're not working for you. Okay. That said it, plain and simple. Because what it is these are justifications for servitude and someone making money off of someone else's labor. That's why suddenly race became very important, because they were rebelling against the capitalists there in 1776 and bonds people who had a lot more in common with people who were enslaved than they did with the slave owners.
Thank you.
And then privileges. And after Bond's rebellion, they still, of course, were huge in, you still couldn't run for office if you didn't have property, but they gave whites some advantages. which bought them off, very sadly. We need each other to win, and that should be the basis for all of us.
Okay, thank you. I believe Ellen had a question.
The class analysis of capitalism and critical race theory. And what are we going to do about educating the next generation if the right wing has taken this notion of critical race theory to stop the teaching of racism or economics the way we are understanding it in schools?
We have to fight that on a school board level and on a national level, because what that is excusing, it's whitewashing, and as a double meaning, our history. Just like in AA and all the 12-step programs, you have to have a fearless moral inventory of where you've gone wrong. In order to be the democracy we need, we have to look at where we went wrong. And we went wrong from the very beginning. The Constitution allowed 6% of the population to vote because you had to be white, you had to be male, you also had to own property. That left out 94% of the population. That was a mistake. Now, we had great things about our Constitution. We had a check on the different powers of government. Unfortunately, since there were so many slave owners in the group, we didn't have any check on money, who can buy whose vote. And we sure do need one. But we have to fight. People have to unite. And I think we should unite under one banner, either a new party or the Socialist Party or whatever we decide. Because only by being together, we don't have the money, but we do have the number, and they can't do without us. One of the things that stopped the Shah in Iran last time was the general strike. And that's what they're trying to do in Iran now, where everyone stops working. Because when everyone stops working, people realize, hey, we make this place work. If we don't do the work, they can't make their money, and the party is over. And one of the things you're noticing in the United States is there's more strikes than there were since the 1930s, because people are realizing the basic class division is between employer and employee. And of course, power has something to do with it. The inflation is because of power, because they decided to sanction Russia to enhance America's power vis-a-vis Russia and China, because Russia and China are a very powerful partnership, because China is the most populous nation, Russia is the biggest nation with the most natural resources, and the United States is being outcompeted. And that's why OPEC can tell us to go pound sand when we tell them to produce more oil. And that's why only 4 countries of Africa showed up for the big African, supposedly all-African fight on our side in the Ukraine, or to give resources. The balance of power is changing, so power does count. But if we unite, we are the mass. Any general strike brings that country down. I'm not saying we need a general strike over critical race theory, but right now we need to unite to go to the board meetings, to speak out and have a national voice that represents our point of view.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, hope I answered it.
Marianne, you had a question?
Well, while Marianne is getting ready, I didn't finish one of the points I wanted to make about inflation.
Okay.
So I want to do that while Marianne gets ready, which is the inflation was caused because cheap Russian oil wasn't being sent to Europe. Therefore, they had to bargain for higher prices for oil, including oil from the United States, which has a lot of oil. Well, American oil and gas companies didn't want other companies to undersell them. So they raised the prices, and every price has some participation of electricity in it. We need gas and electricity to move food. We need gas to run the machines that are farm machines. We need that for everything. So everything went up so they could keep their profits up. That's an example of power and capitalism deciding things that hurt all of us. And if we all got together, we could stop it. So I finished that point.
Okay, thank you. Assuming that the right, especially the religious right, has taken over the conversation in this country about rights, and can you help us understand what are your thoughts about what we can do about this?
Well, I think we need a counterforce, because I think one of the reasons that the right became so popular is the same reason that fascists recently won in Italy, and that fascism has grown all over the world, is that when people are cheated, when their dream is over, as the American dream, if you work hard and you're white and male, you can get somewhere, that's over. It's not only over for Black people who never had that, it's over for everybody. So they look for answers. And the religious right offers simple-minded answers where they can suck up and kick down to whoever is beneath them. We need to have a national presence that gives answers, as well as local presences that give answers, so that we can fight that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and answers, yes, it does.
And we need an organization. We need a national presence with local chapters.
I have a question. I'm concerned that people of color, Black people in particular, I should say, I want to stop using that word. African-centered people have, a lot of us don't see that we have a democracy.
Sure.
And yet I hear a lot of people saying our democracy, and we wonder where that's coming from, and what is your take on that?
Well, it's not a democracy if you can't participate fully. I mean, look, we have had terrible caste and race discrimination throughout our history. And now there's a concerted effort to keep Black people from voting. In World War I, when they wanted to put down the strikes, in World War I, when Andrew Carnegie and the other big robber barons really wanted to put down strikes, they wanted to divide people from one another. And they mapped out the United States in colors so that, some sections were labeled red because they had immigrants who were Russians, who they thought were Bolsheviks, which of course wasn't true. Some were in Black because it had a majority of Black people, and so on. And I think Black people have never had a democracy. Native Americans haven't either. When the date when every state allowed Native Americans to vote was 1962. Whoa. What happened in the United States was we had a brief period of Reconstruction where the government pledged itself to help Black people undo the horrors and submission of slavery. And then I think it was Hayes, I'm not sure, but whoever ran after the Civil War made a deal with the Southern white plantation owners that they'd bring back Jim Crow and slavery in the form of Jim Crow if they got those votes. And they got those votes, and the Ku Klux Klan got a new lease on life, and lynching was boosted. And all those devices to keep people from being equal citizens were put in force. And many of them, those biases are still in force. That problem has not been changed economically or politically. And what you'd have to do, Martin Luther King said it very well. He was talking to the Longshoremen's Union, and that union had excluded Blacks. And they lost their strike because then Blacks became strike breakers, makes sense. But then they allowed Blacks in and they won their strike. And Martin Luther King came in and said, The answer to racism is unions fighting for economic justice together, because we have a whole lot more in common than we do difference. And that doesn't create a lot of hostility between people, because the mass of American people are immiserated now. Now there are over 40% of people in America who can't afford $500 in the worst emergency. They have no way of getting that. And we also have our 4 largest employers, which are Amazon, Walmart, call centers, and fast food, which all have clickers to keep people on task, which go off as soon as you stop, so that you have, I think it's 2 minutes and 33 seconds at McDonald's between a customer comes in and if there's no wait, goes out with their burger. And if you can't serve at that time, your little beeper goes off and your supervisor talks to you. So you are really an extension of a robot. The same with call centers. You have a certain amount of time. And if you can't resolve doing something in that time, you get called in and you're fired. And so the work conditions are terrible. And people are up against it, which is why there are so many strikes now. And so we do have hope of a united labor movement, which has to be a component. By the way, I didn't say what I should have said, that in France, in Colombia, and in Chile, in all those huge revolutionary changes, the labor movement joined. Our labor movement has not been progressive enough ever since the McCarthy era throughout the leftists, the socialists, and the communists. And that's really hurt our labor movement. Our labor movement is so weak that in Germany and all over Scandinavia, they don't allow outsourcing. If you want to outsource your factory, you have to get an equal job for everybody in your factory. So it's easier for them to make something else than it is for them to outsource. But we didn't have our labor movement push that. And it's a backward labor movement, but that labor movement has to join whatever we do because we're the majority. And racism has been a big part of our capitalism since our founding. Fathers were, we had plenty of slaveholders in those founding fathers.
David, I believe David had a question.
Yes, thank you very much for all that you've done. As I think about it, when I think about the United States and the capitalism and imperialism that's in effect here, from the beginning, as I see it, they wanted to take over from the monarchy, and we claimed that we wanted a democracy, but that is not what was wanted. In other words, the leading people here, the ruling class, wanted to take over for the king and run America, but not create a democracy. And the Constitution, and later on, after Bacon's Rebellion, allowed states to have 2 senators. And now we have a situation where a state like Wyoming has 400,000 people, and another state like California has 40 million. So how can you have democracy that way and say that democracy is your goal when you have capitalism and imperialism?
You can't really. And what has happened to us is because they crushed the socialist movement and the communist movement and the left movement so thoroughly with anti-communism in the 50s, the left didn't recover. And so we don't have what they have all over Europe and Scandinavia, which is alternative parties. They have proportional representation, which means that if you get 20% of the votes, you have 20% of the seats in the Congress. And that's what it really should be, one person, one vote. But they wanted all the states to unite, and so they gave them an equal number of senators, even though It's bizarre and absurd, and a good movement would go against it. It's foolish. Also, they want to have things states' rights because the corruption can take over more thoroughly. So that, there's a lot of changes that have been made, but we haven't, as a people, had a voice. We started to with the socialist gains in the before World War I, and then again with the Communist Party in before and then a little after World War II, but then they really came down on them because in World War II, our ally was, who actually, was one of the two winners of that war, was Russia, was the Soviet Union, was Russia then. He was referred to by our press as Uncle Joe. That was Joe Stalin, because they lost 30 million people in that war and were on our side. And so FDR had many communists and socialists in his administration. Francis Perkins, his labor secretary, was a outspoken socialist, and they wanted to get rid of those people in a hurry. And when FDR died, they, with the help of the House Un-American Activities Committee, got rid of the whole left. And the left was the Communist Party, with all of its flaws, was the biggest proponent of racial equality. The strikes of tenant farmers in the South in the 1930s, united black and white tenant farmers, was written up by a book by Adolph Reed, an amazing African-American scholar who wrote Hammer and Hoe, and he wrote about those strikes. But by crushing the communists, they also did do a lot of crushing of people who were fighting for racial equality. It's, we've had a terrible history of repression of progressive things, and we need a national and local voice with different values of all of us together as equals for democracy, for real democracy.
Okay, how do we overcome the oppression? It just seems like it's overwhelming. I know that the GOP and Democrats as well use communism and socialism as a boogeyman, and the people, unfortunately, are cowed by that. So how do we overcome that?
Well, some of people are still cowed by that, others aren't. AOC says she's a socialist.
It's true.
And because she serves her constituents so well, nobody cares. Mm-hmm. I don't, someone as crazy as Marjorie Taylor Greene calls people fascist communists, Marxists, whatever, which those are contradictory things. The communists fought the fascists. One of the reasons that Europe has still a lot, has huge socialist parties is because it was the communists that led the resistance. And so even though the United States didn't give them any Marshall Plan money, if they had Communist Party members in their universities, those university professors went into the unions. The left university professors went in and strengthened the unions. And they have communist and socialist trade unions who endorsed Mélenchon. That's why the German metal workers last year got a 22% raise with the same amount of hours so that they could have better work-home balance and more relaxation. They got more vacation days. That's why they all, the French have a month's paid vacation. Even Brazil has 6 weeks of paid vacation. Americans don't have any guaranteed paid vacation because they split people apart from each other. We have to join one big union because there's so many of us and because white people are catching on. Hey, it's dead for you too, buddy.